It's a little bit late start, so we'll do this quickly. But it is really hard to come up with ideas for what to do for Christmas classes, I find. And I spent a few days going through other ministers' talks and stuff on New Church Audio and things I could find and say, well, what are you guys doing? And I just want to say how boring I found most of them. I thought, oh, this is terrible. I couldn't do this to somebody. And
this point being how hard it is to find something different, not just always the same thing.
No.
Well, I mean, the story is obvious. So
yeah. Well, so when I look back at stuff that we've done, like last year, we did the theme of darkness around Christmas. And you can do themes of angels around Christmas and things like that. And as I was looking through the concordance for different things, I found that Swedenborg, he wrote an index to the Arcana. And in it, there is this heading, why the Lord was born into the world. And he's like, bing, 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 10, 15 passages as to, this is reason number one, and this is where we see it. And, he just kind of goes through it. So that's nice and to the point. And it covers the whole range of things as to why the new church sees the Advent as necessary, which obviously exceeds just the standard, the Lord's coming to the world to save us from our sins kind of thing. So I thought it might be interesting just to have, instead of a deep dive on some particular angle, but to back it up and take a bird's eye view as to how the new church sees that the Advent was necessary. So that's what we're going to do. And as you can see, there are 37 slides. I think is what that says. Yeah, 37 slides. Some pictures I put in. So here we go. Let's go. Let's go. Let's try this way. Here we go. So here we go. And this particular heading is what Swedenborg says. The Lord is called the seed of the woman. You can see AC 256. So he's talking in early Arcana around Adam and Eve. He says, not only faith, but also the Lord himself is called the seed of the woman. Because for one thing, he alone imparts faith, and so is faith itself. And for another, he chose to be born, and in particular to be born within a church which, on account of self-love and love of the world, had sunk completely into a hellish and devilish proprium. He did so in order that from his own divine power he might within his own human essence unite the divine celestial proprium to the human proprium, so that they become one within himself. Had he united them, the world would have perished completely, since the Lord is according to the seed of the woman, the seed is called he and not it. So, right. So if I like to substitute the word ego for proprium. So when I read that he's uniting the divine celestial ego, that sense of self, to the human side, which is that Mary side of things. So he's bringing it down, and in some of this research to do all this class, one of the things that Jonathan Rose describes it as, he says, it's as if you have to build something on site. He says sometimes things are too big and too powerful to transfer it in one shot. You've got to just build the equipment on site. And he's making the case that the divine essence was too powerful just to come down on its own. So you've got to have this human form and build all this stuff on Earth so as to not blow everything up. So if you kind of think of it in those terms, kind of like a power transformer, he's bringing it down. So that's reason number one. You want to read one?
I want to.
That'd be great.
He was coming to make a sacrifice, so the ancients sacrificed children. Mine. The Lord's future coming into the world and his suffering of death had been known since most ancient times. The existence of that knowledge then may be recognized plainly from the custom prevalent among the Gentiles of sacrificing their own children, which they did in the belief that by so doing they made atonement and satisfied God.
Nothing makes God happier than killing kids. Oh. So the idea that the Lord was coming to make a sacrifice, so the ancients wanted to emulate the sacrifice, and so they sacrificed their own children.
Oh, that was quite good. Too.
Yep. Shows you just how messed up they were, right?
You're right.
So it keeps on going.
John might not be able to hear.
John might not be able to hear us reading it, but he can read
Oh,
along though.
good point. Good point. All right. So the next slide, continuation of that passage is, they would never have made this abominable custom their major religious activity unless they had received from the ancients knowledge of a future coming of the Son of God, of whom, so they believed, a sacrifice would be made. Children of Jacob too inclined to this abominable practice, as also did Abraham, for nobody is tempted except through that to which he has an inclination. The fact that the children of Jacob had those inclinations is clear in the prophets. But to prevent them from plunging into that abominable practice, the introduction of burnt offerings and sacrifices was permitted. So, the point around the Advent is, yes, this idea that, hey, we know God's coming to make a sacrifice. That must make God happy, so we're going to offer up our children. And it's interesting that, he makes this note about Abraham. So apparently Abraham was, yeah, and we see that in the Jacob and Isaac story, where he's,
Didn't bat an eyelash.
well, yeah, but he was willing to do it. We don't know how much eyelash batting there was, but he was willing to.
Yeah.
And
But
You know,
insight into that.
yeah, it speaks to the people, right?
Well, and he was also idolatrous, or there was people then.
Yeah.
So.
And so when you think about all the ancient church stuff we've talked about, and then kind of tie this into it, you see these remnants of the ancient church. The idolatry, the turn to just natural kind of rituals and sacrifices and stuff like that. And so when you see these, where he says burnt offerings were permitted, and you'll see that idols to extent were permitted, things, the Lord does an awful lot to accommodate us, to give us a lesser evil to choose from, right? There's always something, okay, you're doing this, well, how about you do this lesser evil instead? Still not good, but killing cows is better than killing children. So, yeah.
Not according to vegans.
Not according to vegans.
Trendy lefties.
Well, they still would agree, I think, that killing cows is better than killing children. They don't like killing cows, but it's an improvement on killing children.
Oh, true.
That's right. This is perhaps a reason that you're familiar with. He came to fight the hells. Anyone who has not been given to know heavenly arcana may imagine that there was no necessity for the Lord's coming into the world to fight with the hells. And by means of temptations, he suffered to war successfully against them and overcame them, since divine omnipotence could at any point have subdued them and confined them to their own particular hells. Right? Isn't that kind of a shortcut? He didn't need to come to the world. He could have just snapped his finger and put them back in their hells. He didn't have to come to this world. Seems kind of sensible. God's all powerful. He just got to snap his finger, wave his hand, and everything's fixed.
Well, that's a big argument that atheists use.
Yeah.
Fix it up now.
Right. That it was nevertheless necessary stands as an unchanging truth. To disclose merely the most general aspects of those arcana, however, would take up a whole work and would also provide opportunities for reasonings about divine mysteries, which, though disclosed, people's minds would not grasp, nor would the majority wish to grasp them. That speaks to your atheist materialist, Cliff. They wouldn't grasp it, and they don't want to grasp it. I always love it when he puts things in there like that. You're not going to get it. It is enough, therefore, if people know, and since it is so, believe it to be an eternal truth that unless the Lord had come into the world by means of the temptations which he suffered and had overcome and conquered the hells, the human race would have perished. And that if he had not done so, none who had lived on this planet, even from the time of the most ancient church, could have been saved. So, yeah, he had to come to fight the hells. You don't understand why, and that's okay.
So that's what he's saying about why he didn't snap his fingers.
Yeah, well, that's what it says. It would provide opportunities for reasoning about divine mysteries, which, though disclosed, people's minds would not grasp. Now, what I do find interesting about that statement, though, is look at this AC 1676. That's early arcana. And I think in later works, we do get more disclosure around the divine mysteries about how he had to come and why he had to fight the hells. I think we get more on this later, but early in the series, he's not overly optimistic about our ability to grasp these things. Okay. The next reason, he came to save the spiritual as opposed to the celestial. The Lord did not come into the world to save those who are celestial, but to save those who are spiritual. The most ancient church, which was called man, was celestial, and if this church had remained uncorrupted, there would have been no need for the Lord to be born a human being. But as soon as it began to decline, the Lord foresaw that the celestial church would cease to exist altogether in the world, and therefore a prophecy was given there and then about the Lord's coming into the world. Genesis 3:15. So you bruise the heel, but he stomps on the head. No, prophecy. After the era of that church, there was no longer a celestial church, but a spiritual church. The ancient church, which came after the flood, was this spiritual church. This church, or the people who belonged to the spiritual church, could not have been saved unless the Lord came into the world. This is what the Lord's words in Matthew are used to mean. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So, yeah. Important to kind of keep perspective as, who he's trying to save.
Well, and at first when it was saying that he came to save the spiritual, not the celestial, it sounded like there was the option that they were both there at the same time. But no, actually there wasn't any celestial left. He came only after the celestial. It says the celestial church ceased to exist. So it wasn't that he came and there were the celestial and the spiritual and he saved only the spiritual. There weren't any celestial left. So
yeah. Yep. That's right. So yeah, and you're going to see this theme develop about, if you look elsewhere in the writings, well, what happens in the second coming? Well, he's there to form those natural heavens. So you're starting to see this building up of heavens from this earth. And once again, it's an accommodation, right? He is, you're not going to have the highest love as your central love. Well, that's all right. You still want to love other people? We can work with that. We can work with that. I'll create a new heaven for you guys. And I'll come down here and sort things out so you guys can do your good enough stuff. We can make room for that. No, I just think that, we don't often pay attention to the idea of accommodating perhaps as much as we could.
I was just thinking about the spiritual church being about truth as opposed to the celestial about good, and I'm just trying to make sense in my mind about him coming to save this truth thing, as opposed to, like, I'm not making sense of it. I'm just saying it's not because they're living too much with the truth and not enough with the love. That's why he had to save them or something.
They don't have the love.
Okay,
so they need the truth to save them.
Yeah.
And when you get to the New Testament, Jesus says it's the Son of Man who's going to be abused. It's the Son of Man who's going to be crucified. And that's what Swedenborg says is the code, that it's the truth that's being abused. They're falsifying the truth. Never the Son of God that is crucified. The Son of God is never, nothing bad ever happens to him. The Son of Man has to undergo these temptations. So it's all about the truth, because the good's already gone and they need this truth to lead them back to the good. And so that's the challenge of the spiritual person. Can they get their head straight? Another reason he came is to be a light. As for the source itself of light, from eternity has existed from the Lord alone. For divine good itself and divine truth itself, the source of light, is the Lord. The divine human which existed from eternity, John 17:5, was that actual light. Because such light was unable any longer to influence the human race, which had retreated so far from good and truth, and so from the light, had cast itself into darkness, the Lord was therefore willing to be born and assume the human itself. Indeed, in so doing, he was able to bring light not only to the man's rational concepts, but also to his natural ideas. The Lord made divine within himself both rational and natural, so that people who were in such gross darkness could have light. Kind of changes the idea of what light is, right? It's not just, these things. Yeah. So there's going to be more on this light in the next passage here. I'm going to try to do some illustrations to follow this passage. The flow of divine truth. So it being the divine human and not the divine itself, from which divine truth proceeds, it is the divine human, therefore, which is meant here by the dread of Isaac. For as has been stated, it is divine truth which strikes fear into someone, not divine good. It's the truth that confronts you. Oh, gee, Cliff, you really need to stop pushing little old ladies down the stairs. That's confronting, and you learn that you got to stop doing that. That's right. It's the truth that confronts, and that's terrifying when you go, I'm a jerk, and I didn't realize it. It's not the divine good that does that. It's the truth. That is the Lord's divine human and not the divine itself, from which divine truth proceeds, is a secret that has not been disclosed up to now. The implications of the secret are as follows. So this is going to go on for a few slides. So we'll try to illustrate this afterwards because it gets kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Before the Lord came into the world, the divine itself flowed into the whole of heaven. And because heaven at that time consisted for the most part of those who were celestial, that is, who were governed by the good of love, that influx of God's almighty power furnished the light which shone in the heavens, and with that light, wisdom and intelligence. Right? Paradise. God's there. He lights the whole place up. Everything's fine. But when the human race departed from the good of love and charity, it was no longer possible for that light to be provided by way of heaven.
So at the fall of the most ancient.
Yep. Nor consequently for the wisdom and intelligence to come through to the human race. For this reason, so that the human race might be saved, the Lord out of necessity came into the world and made divine the human within himself, in order that as
to that divine human, he might become divine light. And in so doing might bring light to the whole of heaven and to the whole of world. A lot of divines there, right? He had been from eternity light itself. So the divine itself passing through the heavens was the source of that light. And it was the divine itself which took on the human and made this human divine. And once that human had been made divine, he was then able to bring that light not only to the celestial heaven itself, but also to the spiritual heaven and the human race too. Got all that? So this is what I do during the day. I create PowerPoint images. So this is how I understand the beginning of that passage. You have the Lord. He is light. That light goes down to heaven, which is really the celestial heaven at that time. And that light just passes on through down to the natural world. It's all connected. Everybody's doing what they're supposed to. It's great. Yep. But at some point, the natural world says, nope, we don't want your light. Thank you very much. And with that, the light no longer passes through. So there's been a rejection of that. So the Lord says, okay, it's not democracy. You don't get to vote on whether there's light or not. And so I'm going to come down to the world myself to bring some light directly to you. And in doing so, yeah, I'm bringing light. And it's so that somebody can choose the light, because if there's just darkness, then nobody has a choice. And in doing so, bringing that light down, there's this creation of a second/spiritual heaven. And with that, people from the natural world can go up and inhabit this space, which then allows the Lord to bring light to that heaven and through that heaven back to the natural world. So now he's got, this is what the writings call immediate influx and mediate influx. So the immediate would be the stuff here, the Lord's going directly down to the people involved. And then there's this mediate where it passes through various realms. Now, of course, this chart is not current because we've had this same problem happen again after the Advent, where the world once again says, no thanks, we really like darkness. And the Lord says, well, some of you don't. Let's accommodate one more time, and we have a third heaven. Wow, that was some possums in our ceiling.
That's what they don't say.
Oh my, I have never.
Skittering around quite a bit.
Yeah.
What about that town that's not there?
They're on top of the roof.
Are they in the roof, not the ceiling?
Well, it's in the ceiling.
The
ceiling in that room comes in.
So should we just close the door to
I
that?
think it is, but I'll double check.
Dinner and a show here tonight. So anyway,
You're right.
so that's how I understand that passage. And unless any of you think I've misrepresented the diagrams here, I'm willing to hear that. But yeah, I do think it's actually worth, that point of it's not a democracy. I kind of put it there a little tongue in cheek, but at the same time, isn't that reality? The Lord's saying, no, you guys don't get to vote your way out of here. You can't close the doors to heaven for everybody else going forward. No, we're gonna leave that open. So, you can go to any Christian church and they'll tell you, well, God had to come into the world to save it. But you're certainly not going to get this kind of idea of how the heavens stopped up God's light. Put a blockade there and say, no. I need to bring some light to the world. So there you have it. lock that down. Another reason why we have Christmas is because people needed to have an image of God. It's evident that the acknowledgement and worship of the Lord's divine human constitutes the life of religion, and also from the fact that people's disposition is such that they wish to worship one of whom, by the use of their perception and thought, they can form some mental idea, or in the case of those who are ruled by their senses, one of whom they can have some sensory image, right? We like to have something we can grasp. Nor do they wish to worship him unless the divine is present within him. This is a common feature throughout the human race. Consequently, Gentiles worship idols in which they believe one who is divine is present, while others worship people that have died whom they believe to be gods or else saints. For nothing else can be stimulated in man unless there is something to bring his senses into play. You know, and it's interesting, I hadn't thought of it in those terms. With all the polytheism we've looked at in our ancient church series, you know, what's the common thread? Yeah, there's some being, and they've got something divine present within them. You know, they can throw thunderbolts, they can part the seas, everybody's got something. And yeah, it's like, you know, kids worshiping superheroes because that's their divinity within them, kind of thing.
Is this bit about nothing can be stimulated in man unless there is something to bring his senses into play? Is that saying that these are natural people by definition because of the senses?
Yep. Yep.
But he's saving the spiritual, not the natural. No?
Well, I think he's showing that there's quite a bit of devolution throughout this process. You know, the senses came into play when Adam and Eve ate the fruit. They became sense-oriented. So you look at, you're going to see more of this, so kind of hang on to that. The majority of those who say that they acknowledge a supreme being, but of whom they have no mental picture, do not acknowledge any God, but nature instead, which they acknowledge because they have a mental grasp of what this is. Very many learned persons among Christians are like this, and for the added reason that they do not believe that the Lord's human is divine. Therefore, to withhold from the worship of wood and stones, these people who have set themselves far apart from the divine and have become bodily minded, to withhold them also from the worship of anyone after his death, and so of some devil within this person, instead of the worship of God himself, because they could not perceive him in any way. This is a really long sentence. Thus, to withhold everything of the church from destruction, and the human race along with the church, the divine was willing to take the human upon himself and make this divine. Let the learned beware, therefore, of thinking the Lord's human without at the same time believing this is divine. Otherwise, they set themselves a stumbling block and at length believe nothing. So basically what he's saying is, in order to prevent you from worshiping idols, the Lord came into the world. That's what that is trying to say, I think. Now, to withhold you from worshiping wood and stone and people who have died and whatnot, you got to stop with that. I will come here myself in human form, and you can worship the real thing, is what he's saying. So once again, an accommodation. You know, it's very easy for us to say, you know what, you don't do what I think you should do, bah, I don't, you know, canceled. You're canceled. You're canceled. And the Lord had plenty of reasons to say, you guys are canceled. I'm done with you guys. All right, you're going to worship stones and wooden sculptures and stuff like that? Fine. I will come here myself. I will leave the friendly confines of my eternal paradise, come down here so you guys can hate on me. But some of you won't. Some of you won't. So, coming for you guys. And that's where we go to this other idea of protecting the evil. Another one of, I really like this part of New Church theology. I don't think people outside the new church really like it too much. They want to see the evil get punished. But I think it's kind of a quirky thing that, God cares for the evil. With regard to the profanation of truth, the position is that the divine truth cannot possibly be profaned except by those who have already acknowledged it. For these people have, first of all, through acknowledgement and faith, come to the truth, and so have been introduced into it. If after this they depart from that truth, there remains within them a permanent imprint of it, which is recalled together with falsity and evil whenever these are recalled. And being attached to falsity and evil, that truth is consequently made profane. People, therefore, with whom this happens have within them permanently that which is condemning, and so the hell which is their own. This can sound, I find people get spiritual hypochondria when they talk about profanation because, you go, oh, well, gee, I've learned some stuff and I don't do everything right, and therefore I'm this profaner. But the idea here is that they've been mixed so thoroughly, it's where you can't separate the fact that you love something that you hate, right? If you're in the middle of doing something evil, but you're not giving mental consent to it, it's a different place. And what we hear elsewhere about profanation is that in the spiritual world, we go through this process of vastation. So, Patricia wakes up in the next life and all the bad parts of Patricia get, put off to the side and gotten rid of. So all we have is good Patricia left. Bad Patricia's gone. But in profaners, there's equal amounts of both, and so you have to strip out everything, and there's nothing left. There's no purpose, there's no life, because the good and the evil were stripped away. So it's a very terrible hell to be in, because you don't actually get to invest in your love.
So profanation's a pretty bad thing.
It's the worst.
I know.
It's the worst.
Okay.
So don't do it.
Never. Never.
Indeed, when those in hell draw near to a sphere where good and truth are present, they instantly experience their own hell. For they run into that which they hate, and as a consequence, into torment. People, therefore, who have profaned truth dwell permanently with that which torments them, the intensity of the torment depending on the degree of profanation. So because they have both, no matter where they go, they're tormented. Right? If you're a committed devil, you can be content in hell. If you're a committed angel, you can be content in heaven. But a profaner is not content anywhere they go, because no matter where they go, there's something that they hate. This being so, the Lord makes the greatest provision to prevent divine good and divine truth being made profane. He does so especially with anyone who is such that he cannot help profaning them by keeping them as far back as possible from acknowledgement of faith and in truth and good. For as has been stated, no one is able to profane them except him who has already acknowledged and come to believe them.
Can you give an example? I know what it means, but give an example of profaning writers.
Well,
in this case, I know you can
imagine you get married,
yeah.
and you love your wife and everything is basically good, and you believe that monogamous marriage is good.
Yeah.
But then you mix in some other stuff. You go, well, you know what? It sure was fun to go down to that brothel downtown back in my younger days. I actually enjoyed that. And somehow you convince yourself that actually that's okay. And so, but my marriage is fine. And so you start mixing the old stuff, and you start walking away from the truth that marriage is one man and one woman. You walk away from that. You know what? Actually, I want an open marriage. And I want lots of women all the time, all that kind of stuff. And so when you are interacting in your marriage, what you're really thinking about is all this other stuff. Not actually about a chaste marriage. You're thinking about all these other girls, these that you want to be with. And so whenever something good about marriage comes up, you're not thinking about the good stuff. You're thinking about the bad. And so you've mixed the two.
But what happens when the person says, "Oh, you're saying profanities, like swearing, using the words"?
Yeah.
But is that?
I mean, you can, second commandment, thou shalt not use the Lord's name in vain, right? So you profane the Lord's name when you use it as a curse.
That's bad too.
But as all things, there are degrees of it. I mean, you say something, it's not, it goes back to the bigger
If you
picture.
say the F-bomb or something like that, that's a profanity, but it's not really. I mean,
Is that going to be what takes you to hell? No.
Exactly. Yeah, I see this.
The Lord makes the greatest provision to prevent these things being made profane. This was the reason why internal truths were not disclosed to the descendants of Jacob, to the Israelites and Jews. Not even the existence of anything internal within man, nor thus any kind of internal worship, was openly declared to them, and scarcely anything about life after death, or about the heavenly kingdom of the Lord, or the Messiah whom they awaited. So you can often think about this in terms of evangelization. Why is it more people aren't joining the new church? Maybe because they would profane it if they did.
That's another thing too, yeah.
The reason why these truths were not declared was, as foreseen, that if they had been disclosed to them, the Jews and the Israelites were such as could not help profaning them, for they had no desire for anything other than that was earthly. Think about modern civilization. How many people have a desire for anything other than what is material? And because those descendants were such, and are so still, they are still allowed to remain without any belief at all in internal truths. For if at one point they had given their assent to them and then had withdrawn it, they would inevitably have ended up in the worst hell of all. This was also the reason why the Lord did not come into the world and reveal the internal features of the Word until the time when no good at all, not even natural good, remained with them. For at that point they were no longer capable of receiving any truth and acknowledging it internally, for good is what receives. And so we're no longer capable of profaning it. It is this state that is meant by the fullness of time and by the close of the age, and also by the last day spoken of many times in the prophets. So the Lord has to wait until, and why is he waiting? He's waiting for the sake of the evil. He's waiting so that people don't put themselves in a worse hell than they're already headed towards. So, what is the Lord's priority? The more I read, I think the Lord's greatest priority is to prevent people from going to a worse hell. That's higher priority than getting Cliff into a higher heaven. Right? He'd rather see Patricia go from the worst hell to the middle hell than Cliff to go from the middle heaven to the highest heaven.
So basically, if you're in heaven, that's good enough. Doesn't matter which one. But
Yeah, you're in.
yeah, he's not too concerned with that. He wants to prevent
But
others
if he
from getting worse.
he can get Owen out of that lowest hell, that's what he wants. That's what he wants. Which isn't a traditional Christian view. This might be my other favorite teaching of this series. In the internal sense of the word, the Lord's entire life is described, as it was going to be when he was in the world, even as to his perceptions and thoughts, for these things had been foreseen and provided, since they were from the divine. Further reason for this provision of them in the internal sense was so that the things of the Lord's life in the world might be manifested as present realities to the angels who perceive the word according to its internal sense. In this way, the Lord was placed before them, and at the same time, the manner in which he gradually cast off the human and put on the divine. The point of it is, the angels were given prophecies in the word about the Lord's coming, so they wouldn't freak out and go, oh my gosh, everything's terrible. These people, what are they doing? Oh, the Lord's coming, it's all going to be fine. This is my present reality. They see the future as right now. And I think that's really cool. How many times do we freak out over what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? Oh, who is so-and-so going to get elected? Is so-and-so going to leave office peacefully? Just for example, what's going to happen? And the angels are going, oh, you know what? Look, Lord's coming. It's going to be fine. We don't need to freak out. These people are worshiping stone and whatnot. We don't need to freak out. It's going to be all right. And I find it interesting for two reasons, because the writings tell us that what makes angels happy is that they don't have worries about the future or cares about the past. They're in the moment right now. And yet this kind of implies that you can bump them off their log, right? This implies that, you can freak out an angel and if you're not careful. So the Lord's like, well, I'm not going to mess you guys up. You guys need to focus on the reality. So I think there's a slight knock on the angels that they just, they can worry at times, even if they're not supposed to. Unless these things had been manifested to the angels as present realities by means of the word, and also by means of all the religious observances of the Jewish church, it would have been necessary for the Lord to come into the world immediately after the fall of the most ancient church, which is called man or Adam. The Lord's advent was foretold. What is more, the human race existing at that time could not otherwise have been saved. So how about them apples?
I want to say Genesis 3:15.
That's the quote about he will bruise your heel and I will stomp on his head thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, so the most ancient church crashing would have freaked out the angels if they didn't have this.
They were freaking out.
Well, okay.
They were freaking out. So we're going to give them some prophecies. Hey, let you know it's going to be all right.
Yeah.
Okay. Might take a few thousand years. Be patient.
Yeah.
But it's okay. And I threw this passage in. That was the end of the Swedenborg series, and this one I'll throw in from Coronis. People would be lost in their spiritual struggles unless they looked with confidence to the Lord and fully assured themselves that the whole work and ability of deliverance came from him alone. It is for these reasons that the coming of the Lord is so frequently foretold in the old prophetic word. The same reason the Lord is proclaimed in the new evangelical and apostolic word in his second coming foretold. Right? I've got to tell you guys a bunch, because otherwise you're going to freak out. People would be lost in their spiritual struggles unless I told you over and over and over again, I'm coming. I've got this. Calm down. Right? Like Paul's works. So, and here's your bonus slides. It's one passage that I came across, but it's over like 4 slides. But I couldn't help but throw it in, being what we've been doing lately. Yes, it's bonus content. With the ancient church, which existed after the flood, their doctrinal teachings were, for the most part, external representatives and meaningful signs which had internal truths stored within them. For the majority of its members, holy worship consisted in those external representatives and signs. Okay? If anyone told them that the essential ingredients of divine worship were not those representatives and meaningful signs, but the spiritual and celestial realities represented and meant by these, they would have rejected them altogether. And so the church would have ceased to exist. This applied even more to the Jewish church. If anyone had told them that their religious observances received their holiness from the divine things that were the Lord's within them, they would have not acknowledged them at all. How many times have people raised their hands and say, well, if the Bible has all this internal meaning to it, why doesn't the Lord just plainly state it? Because they wouldn't have believed it. They would have rejected it, and everything would have stopped. So forget this stuff. We're not doing that. Such also was mankind when the Lord came into the world. They had grown even more bodily minded, especially so those who were members of the church. This is quite evident from the disciples who, though with the Lord constantly and hearing so many things about his kingdom, were as yet unable to perceive interior truths. Right? Boy, that's a condemnation. You guys were right there with them for years, and you still didn't get it. They were still unable to have any other concept of the Lord than such as exists with the Jews at the present day about the Messiah, whom they are still awaiting. They imagine that he would promote that people to a position of dominion and glory over all nations throughout the world. And after hearing so many things from the Lord about the heavenly kingdom, the disciples were still unable to think anything else, and that the heavenly kingdom would be like an earthly kingdom, where God the Father would be supreme, and after him the Son, then themselves the 12, and so would reign in this order. For this same reasons also James and John asked to sit on one on his right and the other on the left, and the rest of the disciples were angry at those two, wishing to be greater than the rest. For the same reason, after teaching them what it is to be the greatest in heaven, the Lord still spoke in the way that they themselves thought. That is to say, he spoke of them sitting on 12 thrones and judging 12 tribes of Israel. If they had been told that the word's disciples was not used to mean themselves, but all the people in whom the good of love and faith dwells, and also that in the Lord's kingdom there are no thrones, nor positions of government and dominion, as in the world, and that they would not be able to pass judgment on even the smallest aspect of any one person, they would have rejected that saying, and each would have left the Lord and gone back to his own employment. We will go fish, thank you very much. The reason why the Lord spoke in this way, he did, was so that they would receive those things and through them be introduced into internal truths. For within the external truths which the Lord spoke, internal truths lay stored away, which in the course of time are laid bare. And when these are laid bare, those external truths are dispelled and serve solely as the objects or the means thought about internal ones. The means for thought about internal ones. The end. So, I was thinking about all this with that passage, it's just raining down on how bodily and sensory we become. And what do we see in all those ancient church religions? Ritualism, materialism, it's all about, oh, well, Zeus is on a mountain and this is how things work and these gods are jealous and their gods are angry. They just keep the same kind of earthly thinking in their religion. We've got to have the rituals and we've got to make sure that boat is in the tomb because, well, you need a boat here to get around, so surely they need a boat there. Well, we've got to have these servants buried in the tombs with them because when they wake up, they got to have their servants. They're thinking so materialistically. And here Swedenborg is saying, look, yeah, Lord came because everybody was so materialistic and natural thinking. And even when people were right there with him, they didn't get it. They didn't get it. So next time you feel bad about yourself for not getting it, you go, well, hey, these guys didn't get it either. And they were sitting right there next to God. I mean, that would make you feel pretty stupid, wouldn't it? Yeah, I think so. I think the New Testament actions of the disciples show that they were transformed. In fact, if you remember my Easter sermon from about 3 years ago, I talked about that explicitly. So I can recycle that sermon that you're telling me. Boom. Yeah. No, it's I think it's safe to say they were transformed by the resurrection, but they didn't get it up until that time. When you just think about the night of, right? The soldiers come and Peter cuts off the guy's ear because why? He doesn't get it. We're going to protect you. We're not going to let this happen to you. Get away from me, Satan. So there you have it. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Hope you got a quick overview. And if you want, this will be on YouTube tomorrow. And you can watch it again. Missed a reference? Well, it's all right there in the PowerPoint. We can email you slides if you wish, but it is now there for you just to watch. And I got this cool hat on too. Although no, I didn't record the John and me. Yeah, no, I just recorded the screen. So look like I have a puffy cheek though.